Hello class, this is your seedless vascular plants lecture. We're going to cover the true ferns and their relatives. Let's start out with the phylogeny. So using current molecular systematics, we have phylum Monilophyta, which includes the genus Xylotum, the genus Equisetum, and the true ferns, which includes a bunch of different genera. This is what we call the ferns plus the allies, and we can see they fall out nicely here on the tree of life. In addition, we have the so-called lycophytes, which is phylum Lycopodiophyta. These are called the club mosses, but don't get confused because this isn't the same thing as the true mosses, which is the bryophytes that we learned previously. The Lycopodiophyta include species that have vascular tissue. So to update the phylogeny, remember we learned that way to memorize the levels of classification. Don't kill penguins, 'cause our family gets sad. So that helps us remember domain, kingdom, phylum, etc. So if we have phylum Monilophyta, we can break that down into the following classes. Class Psilotopsida, which is the whisk ferns. Class Equicetopsida, which is the horsetails. And class Polypodiopsida, which is the true ferns. In addition to the Monilophyta, the other phylum is the Lycopodiophyta, which is the club mosses. Now for each of these organisms, we want to be able to describe the characteristics of each group. In terms of understanding the complete life cycle, it's just the ferns, the true ferns, that we are focusing on. And then finally, make certain for each of these organisms that we can distinguish if it is homosporous or heterosporous. Now, the definition of these terms, homosporous means it produces one kind of sporangium, and heterosporous means two kinds of sporangia. In either case, the sporangium makes the spores, and the spores germinate to re-establish the haploid gamete-forming generation called the gametophyte. So the early Carboniferous period is when the seedless vascular plants ruled the land, with only a few primitive gymnosperms in the fossil record at this time. By the end of this era, which was 60 million years later, many seed plants had evolved, and due to climate change, most of the coal on our planet was formed at this time. The seedless vascular plants, as you can imagine, don't have seeds, but do have well-developed vascular tissue. This large group also has true roots, in which they can anchor themselves into the soil and absorb nutrients. The seedless vascular plants have small gametophytes with antheridia and archegonia. The antheridium is the region where the sperm is produced, and the archegonium is the region where the eggs are produced. It's important to note that the seedless vascular plants have a gametophyte that is separate from the sporophyte. The sporophyte generation is what makes up most of the plant, and then the gametophyte is just a little chunk of tissue on the ground separate from the sporophyte. The seedless vascular plants do retain the primitive characteristic of needing water for fertilization. So we have to splash the sperm to the egg in order for fertilization to occur. The seedless vascular plants have a dominant sporophyte generation, as do the more advanced seed-producing plants. Recall that the bryophytes are gametophyte dominant. So as we examine these plants, we're going to see that they have different types of leaves. Some members of the seedless vascular plants have microphylls, and these are primitive leaves that have an appendage supplied by a single unbranched vein. Notice there are no axillary buds, rather a dichotomous division apical meristem. Now, a megaphyll, on the other hand, does have branching veins. This is really the leaf as we know it. There's more than one vein. It is always associated with a leaf gap in most cases, and it has true axillary buds. Here are some photos of some of the organisms we'll study today. We'll look at the genus Psilotum, which is the whisk ferns. We'll look at Lycopodium. We'll look at true ferns, and we can see the overall plant form of a typical true fern, as well as the way that the leaves emerge in this structure called a fiddlehead. First up, phylum Lycopodiophyta. And for this course, we have to memorize the two living genera, which is genus Lycopodium and genus Selaginella. Now, the lycophytes as a whole are generically referred to as the club mosses. Remember, these are not true mosses, so it's an unfortunate common name. I like to just refer to them by their genus names instead. And both of these genera produce spores from strobili. The genus Lycopodium is often found growing on the forest floor. We don't have this in California, but we do see a lot of this on the east coast of the United States. Lycopodium develops from branching rhizomes. They have true roots and stems. They have cones that are referred to as strobili, and they have microphyls, which are those primitive leaves without leaf gaps, whorled or in a tight spiral. The stems are simple or branched, depending on the species, and they are all homosporous. So remember, that means there is one sporangium type. So here we can see a cross-section through our strobilus, and there's a big sporangium, there's a big sporangium, and the little dots are the spores. So homosporous species are often referred to as species with one type of spore, but that's not truly accurate. It's more accurate to say that it's one type of sporangium, because you can see there are two types of life strategies. There's a homothallic and a heterothallic, and the root word thallus means body. So in this first cycle, we can see that the sporophyte generation has a sporangium, one single sporangium type, that produces spores by meiosis. And then one single spore type is produced that grows into a bisexual gametophyte. That is to say, one gametophyte that produces both sperm and eggs. So homothallic means we have one single gametophyte type. Homo means one, thallic means body. On the other hand, we're talking homosporous here. So again, it's one type of sporangium that produces spores by meiosis. But look at this. Based upon the genetics, it makes two different types of spores, a so-called male spore and a so-called female spore, or a microspore and megaspore, respectively. And the male spore grows into a male gametophyte. The female spore grows into a female gametophyte. So we refer to this homosporous species as heterothallic because it has two distinct gametophytes. So it's a distinction that I want you to know, but the main thing here is to focus on the definition of homosporous. I want to update that definition to say one type of sporangium. The Lycopodiophyta has spores that produce bisexual gametophytes that have both antheridium and archegonium regions on it. Therefore, it is referred to as homothallic. Now, these gametophytes are super small, so they often have a mycorrhizal fungus relationship. Here we can see the overall life cycle. Now, we want to be familiar with this, but it's really the ferns that we want to memorize every single part of the life cycle for this course. So up next, we need to learn what a heterosporous species is. And that means that the sporophyte produces two distinct types of sporangium. And the sporangium is referred to as the female sporangium or male sporangium, which produces female spores or male spores by meiosis. Therefore, by definition, all heterosporous species are heterothallic, because we're always going to have two types of gametophytes. Some of the lycopods, some of the aquatic ferns, and all of the seed plants are heterosporous. Next up in phylum Lycopodiophyta is the genus Selaginella. And Selaginella is the spike mosses. Again, these aren't mosses that we learned previously. It's an unfortunate common name, so that's why I like to just refer to it by the genus name. Selaginella is found in wet areas and is especially abundant in the tropics. It branches much more freely than Lycopodium, which has the common name of the ground pines. And Selaginella is unique because it's heterosporous. It is going to produce two different kinds of sporangia and spores, and therefore gametophytes. Here we can see a microspore that's contained here inside a microsporangium. And then lower down in this picture, which we can't quite see, is the megaspore and the megasporangium. The sporophytes have microphyls, so those are those primitive leaves without leaf gaps. And Selaginella all has true roots and stems. The strobilus are often not seen. Here we can see it in this picture. I've never actually seen one because the plant in the lab never produces this structure, but rest assured it does produce two kinds of spores. Some Selaginella we've recently discovered can change its chloroplast shape at night, which is kind of amazing. It's thought to play some role in metabolism regulation, but here we can see a species during the day and at night. And here we can see at night the plant almost appears white. It has very little green pigment expressed. The life cycle of Selaginella, again, studying this figure, we can see the microsporangium and the megasporangium. And notice that the megaspore is a much larger circle than the tiny little microspores. All right, so now we move into our next phylum, the Monilophyta. That's the true ferns plus their allies. And the first ally is Psilotum. This is called a whisk fern because it kind of looks like a little whisk broom. It's very primitive in that the fossils date back 400 million years ago, and the sporophytes consist almost entirely of dichotomously forking photosynthetic stems. It has short roots dependent on mycorrhizal fungi. The stems have a central cylinder with xylem and phloem, and it has no microphyls, so no primitive leaves. Instead, it has what are called enations, which are outgrowths of the stem that are spirally arranged as scales or flaps. Now, Psilotum reproduction is as follows. They produce small ball-shaped sporangia that make the spores. They kind of look like these little yellow balls, but they are not technically strobili. There's no sporophylls there. Instead, it's just a sporangium. The spores germinate into small gametophytes, which are non-photosynthetic and have rhizoids and are associated with a fungal mycorrhizae. The Psilotum that we learn about are all homophalic, and that gametophyte is covered with both antheridia and archegonia. Here's the overall life cycle that shows us how Psilotum is homosporous and also homophalic because it produces a bisexual gametophyte. Next up in our phylum Monilophyta is the genus Equisetum. These are the so-called horsetails or scouring rushes. There's about 25 species scattered through all continents. In California, we have a bunch of these that grow in the forest and in some wetland areas. They have significant silica deposits that accumulate on the inner walls of the stem's epidermal cells. This is thought to be for anti-herbivory because it's going to break down the mouths of things that try to eat it. Branches, when present, are normally in whorls at regular intervals along a jointed stem. Now, Equisetum includes both branched and unbranched species, and each have tiny microphyls in whorls at the nodes. The microphyls are fused, forming a collar that basically looks like a little ring of brown parts. There's no green leaves on this species. Instead, sometimes from the nodes, we'll have little buds that grow into more branches. So you'll see a little whorl of branches at the node that grows in some types of these plants. Now, the stems are distinctly ribbed and have obvious nodes and internodes, and in most species, the pith breaks down at maturity, leaving a hollow central canal, so lots of air can exchange, which allows these plants to grow in waterlogged soils. Aerial stems typically develop from horizontal rhizomes. Now, Equisetum can do vegetative propagation by fragmentation, so this is a type of asexual reproduction, but they can also do sexual reproduction, which always begins by producing spores first. The spores are going to grow into the gametophyte, which is where the sexual reproduction occurs. And the sporangia of Equisetum are produced in strobili, which are the cones found at the tips of the stems, very characteristic of the horsetails. All of the extant Equisetum, which is to say the ones that are currently alive on our planet today, are all homosporous. Now, humans do use Equisetum. The horsetails have been used in medicine, but it does have to be used very carefully under the guidance of an herbalist or other doctor because it can be toxic. And by indigenous Californians and other indigenous peoples, these scouring rushes were used for scouring and sharpening tools. All right, and now the most charismatic member of the Monilophyta, the true ferns. This is the largest group. There's over 11,000 species on our planet today, and they vary from tiny aquatic floating forms that are about 1 centimeter to giant tropical ferns that almost look like trees. Of course, they're not trees. There's no woody tissue. But these big tropical tree ferns can be up to 75 feet tall. Now, fern leaves are megaphylls. So those are those more advanced leaves with leaf gaps that we have currently learned about in our course. And these megaphylls are usually referred to as fronds. The frond is typically subdivided into smaller segments that are referred to as the pinny. So a fern leaf looks like a compound leaf, but we don't use that language. Instead, we use the language of a frond and the pinny. Because fronds are megaphylls, they have leaf gaps and branching veins, and the baby fronds, as they unfold, are called fiddleheads. And the fancy word for how they unfold is referred to as circinate vernation. Sori contain sporangia, and the sporangia are typically found on the undersides of the fronds. They usually look like little brown or orange dots on the undersides of the frond. All of the terrestrial ferns are homosporous, but the aquatic ferns are actually heterosporous. But for this class, we just need to memorize a homosporous fern life cycle. The ferns produce stems underground, which are a special type of rhizome. Note, we can point to one single sorus, that's the singular version, or we can refer to all of them as the sori. Now, ferns do sexual reproduction just like the other seedless vascular plants on a little piece of tissue on the ground separate from the parent plant. And the fern gametophyte is a bisexual gametophyte called the prothallus. First off, we have a sporangium that's found in the sorus. It produces a spore. The spore falls down on the ground and grows into a gametophyte. And that gametophyte has a sperm-producing and egg-producing region. Here we can see some diversity of sporangia on ferns. Notice that in this case, the fern sorus is covered up by a flap of tissue that's called the indusium. And then here we can see a photo of a gametophyte with a young sporophyte growing out of it. And when we zoom in on the gametophyte, we can see the archegonium and the antheridium, where the eggs and sperm are produced. This is an interesting fern called the deer's foot fern that produces these fuzzy rhizomes along the ground. And our homosporous fern life cycle makes certain that you can describe all parts of this life cycle as you prepare for the exam. And here's another picture with more photos of this life cycle, where we alternate between the sporophyte and gametophyte generations. As you're studying for the exam, make certain that you can answer these fern life cycle questions. First up, why is the sporophyte, which is the diploid stage, considered dominant? Next up, does the initial growth of the fern sporophyte differ from the moss sporophyte? If so, how are they different? Also, think, how are they the same? And finally, where are the male and female gametophytes produced? As I mentioned previously, some of the ferns are really tiny things. This is the genus Azolla, which is an aquatic fern that grows in ponds. And you can see, even though it's so tiny it fits on the tip of your finger, it does have these little tiny fern leaves. Now, ferns are used by humans extensively. They are extremely popular houseplants and landscaping plants, depending on the place where you live. They can even be eaten. The rhizomes and fiddleheads can be roasted and served as food. Here we can see is some fancy restaurant is serving a young fiddlehead pasta dish. They are used in different folk medicine and herbal practices. The fronds are used by some people as thatching for homes. And the rhizomes can even be used to grow epiphytes and other orchids in the commercial nursery practice. And here's the so-called tree fern. Notice that it's not a tree because there's no secondary growth. This is a seedless vascular plant. That quote-unquote woody appearance is just from upright roots densely covered with a fibrous mantle. All right, so now we've learned all things seedless vascular plants. We learned phylum Monilophyta and Lycopodiophyta. You should now know the characteristics of each group, but be able to draw the details of the fern life cycle. Distinguish between homosporous and heterosporous phyla, and email your professor if you have any questions. All right, that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening.